My name is Kaspar. I'm the Global Partners Digital, and I will be moderating the session. What we'll be talking about today, as you see in the title and the description, is a session on multi-stakeholder cooperation. Now, for a lot of you who have been in this field for a while, you know that there are a number of heated debates continuing to happen on the very term of multi-stakeholderism. What is it? What is it about? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it promote democracy? Does it undermine it? What are the different roles of different people in a multi-stakeholder approach? Now,
without in any way hindering the members of MAGIG making their own submissions and contributions, but at least where we had common views, I think, enabling us to make sure that we were all singing from the same hymn sheet, and again, sort of maximising our influencing ability. And it also helped us to coordinate with stakeholders on the ground. So a number of members of MAGIG were also in their own professional capacities at Net Mondiale, and we were able to use that to make sure that we all understood what was happening. It was a very, I'm sure people who were there will remember, it was a very quite difficult process to follow. A lot of administrative decisions were made very quickly on the ground about how it should operate. And so keeping track of and being in touch with a range of different people who were in different groups and having different conversations throughout, I think would enable us to keep on top of that conversation. And as a result, in part, I think, of the UK's ability to influence, and the other members of the MAGIG who worked incredibly hard in their own capacities and through their own constituencies and networks, we were able to come up with an outcome document which I think exceeded our expectations in terms of the positive language that we were able to achieve. And it'd be really interesting to hear from other members, from Desiree, Dominique, Matthew, Leah, about how they felt that might have helped their own activity when they were on the ground in Net Mondiale as well, not just government. And then the second example I wanted to use was ITU Clinical. We did 18 months worth of planning through MAGIG for that conference. 18 months of going through all of the 64 resolutions, identifying which were the ones that the UK needed to actively participate on, identifying the lines that the UK should adopt for every single one of those, using groups of MAGIG to help inform what the UK positions are, bringing in that external expertise, getting challenge from MAGIG members who are saying, you know, if the government argues this, then you're just going to lose because somebody else is going to argue that. And really getting a sense of how is going to be the strongest, both tactical and approaches to the resolutions. Because of that preparation, we were able to form a delegation which involved a really large multi-stakeholder commission. We ended up with a UK delegation of 30+ members, the largest European delegation, a genuinely multi-stakeholder delegation. I was very clear that if we were taking a multi-stakeholder group to a UN organisation, then we were going to be genuinely multi-stakeholder, and we were going to allow, we were going to make sure that those people who were contributing to the policy had a chance to actually speak at the mic and represent the UK. So I was very clear that it wouldn't only be government talking at the mic, and we were able to give other members of the delegation who weren't government the opportunity to speak and argue and lead on negotiations for resolutions, and that was hugely useful to us as well, because we didn't otherwise have had the capacity to cover all of the range of issues that were being negotiated at Plenipot, let alone the expertise to do it at the level that many of the MAGIG members brought to those issues. And again, we ended up, I think, with, from what was started off as quite a scary negotiation, we ended up with a very positive outcome. And for the UK, I think it was positive in two ways. One, I think the language and the text and the resolutions that we negotiated were as good as we could have expected in the circumstances, and we worked very hard. And again, this was not a UK only effort, this was many member states and multi-stakeholders contributing to this effort. But it ended up being more positive than it could have been. I'm looking at Phil because he's always my pessimist in the room, tries to balance my over-optimistic approach. But also, I think, because we were able to demonstrate at at the ITU in a UN fora that a multi-stakeholder approach can work. I think people saw our large, active multi-stakeholder delegation working, and it made them sit up and take notice and say, actually, you know, they've achieved something here. And I'm enormously grateful to everyone who gave up their time. And let's face it, money. It was very expensive for people to be there for 3 weeks of negotiations. UK government couldn't have provided that level of resource to fund delegations of that size. Even much better for the contributions that they made.
Thank you so much for that very useful overview. Now, what I'd like to do is ask a couple of members of MAGIG from different stakeholder groups to give some reflections on how they see the value of participating in the group. If we could each stick to a couple of minutes, up to 5 minutes, so that we can actually ask people who are not MAGIG members to give their views as well. Maybe I'll start with Matthew. Matthew Shears from CDT. So you represent the civil society constituency within the MAGIG. If you could give your reflections.
Yeah, thank you, Leah. I certainly appreciate the MAGIG's flexibility, above all, because I am actually a UK-based consultant. My main client is the Center for Democracy and Technology, which is a Washington, DC-based entity. So I appreciate the ability to participate in the MAGIG. Let me just go back a couple of steps and say why the MAGIG is important in the bigger picture. We talk a lot about multi-stakeholderism. We talk about it so much that it's almost a mantra. It's something that we assume everybody understands, we assume everybody knows how it works, and we assume that everybody accepts it, which is far from the case. So it's nice actually to see multi-stakeholder practices actually working, actually bringing people to the table, actually having all the stakeholders around the table shaping, discussing, and hopefully shaping policy. And examples of this are actually not that many, and which is the reason why I think there's something to be appreciated here, and also something to be leveraged and something to be exported, if I can put it in that sense. And so that's one of the reasons why this is so important, because we go into discussions in WSIS and we go into discussions elsewhere, and we're always talking about the IGF and ICANN. But what's missing is the national dimension of multi-stakeholderism in practice, and the MAGIG is a good example of how that works. So that's the first point. Second point is that this is really about shaping not just the national debate and how the UK government and UK stakeholders look at these issues, but also shaping the broader debate. As Sarah said, the impact of having a delegation that is truly multi-stakeholder is immense. I remember one rather telling moment in the WSIS discussions when we were having this discussion about multi-stakeholderism with a certain country that said, well, we know that multi-stakeholderism for you means governments aren't involved. I mean, unfortunately, this was just a year ago. So there are real reasons why we have to talk about these kinds of active, credible processes. The value also is that we're seeing, even though it's policy shaping and not decision making, it's a listening process. We are giving, we are taking. I mean, having small subgroups of the MAGIG that work on the IANA transition, on WSIS and on the ITU is an incredibly useful way of getting focus on issues that are of importance to stakeholders. And the diversity of civil society, my team, who are more in the human rights space, so it's an interesting mix of organizations. And I think the value also is that when people see these models working, then they see the delegations, and then they see how this concept of trust that's built among the stakeholders within the MAGIG and elsewhere actually leads to seeing people on delegations, and then that expression of trust actually then reflects very nicely in international fora, where people see these stakeholders working together, which is something that many countries still don't accept. So the more that we have this model, the more that we can promote it, the more that we can show it in action, the more valuable it becomes. And for that reason, it's not just about the UK multi-stakeholderism, it's actually about taking this model and showing that it works and the influence it will have in other fora. So I think that's probably what the most important point I wanted to get across, and just to say that I think this is an excellent model. Thank you.
My name is Dominique Lazanski from the GSMA. We represent 800 mobile operators and 250 mobile ecosystem members of ours, and we do a lot of work in across the world, basically, but also in standards and development and access policy, obviously. I cannot echo enough what Matthew has said, and I often use the MAGIG as an example of, as you just said, multi-stakeholderism that actually works. So when there are governments that we go in to talk to or regulators that we train, which we do through our capacity building program, I often use MAGIG in some of my examples. And I teach internet governance, but I also teach child online protection. And the UK as well also leads a multi-stakeholder approach to that. So I mean, it comes through and it's being imparted internationally. And I hope that you know that, Sarah, even if I don't tell you all the time. But I think from the private sector perspective, there's a couple of interesting things. Generally, private sector participation in internet governance processes tends to be lower than other stakeholder groups. I'm generalizing, mostly because looking at the bottom line, right? So we can't really say if you don't do X, Y won't happen in terms of justifying it. So I'm lucky in the sense that because I work for a trade association, we have an internal internet governance task force that we use to share information. But a key point of that is our relationships with our governments. And I believe we have the strongest one in our group, including member operators from the US, the Middle East. 4 billion, I think, is the number that's been thrown around that need and will get online eventually. So the private sector tends to be sort of lower on the participation scale, just again because of time and resources and various things like that. So having something like MAGIG and having other private sector members with different perspectives as well, there is really, really useful, because we don't necessarily go vote as a block, so to speak, like the G77. We would have over the top players, we have infrastructure players, there's satellite companies, all of them are represented on the MAGIG, and it's academics from the Oxford Internet Institute and various other experts has been extremely useful, valuable for understanding background processes on WSIS, CSTD, Plentypot, things like that. And it's something that I think we need to highlight. Maybe we'll discuss it a little bit further. Just finally, I think one thing I just want to mention is because there's so many different people attending the MAGIG, there's so many different interests and information from different areas that we would not normally get. And I know Matthew had made that point, and Sarah as well. My focus is internet governance, but I also do ITU-T and D. Whereas I don't do ICANN, but other people will do ICANN, or Mark Carbell and sort of others involved like Des and Matthew. And that's been really useful too, because then we do actually really share information, knowing that we can't cover everything all the time. So probably with that.
Thank you, Dominique. Yes, my name is Desiree Miloshevic. I'm one of the team leaders of ISOC England chapter, which is one of the chapter of the Internet Society. There are about 90 plus countries that have Internet Society chapters in cities and countries, and we tend to really deal with some technical issues such as open standards. We really advocate the development and the open development of standards rather than the mandatory standards. And I would say that it was very important to be able to participate in the work of MAGIG in order to provide our input. And the MAGIG itself, when it's been set up, has recognized and acknowledged that the effective participation in any of these international fora where internet policies are debated and set necessarily needs to have input from all stakeholders in order to get a better view, be better informed, and the policy also adopted if they're all discussed by and agreed to by all the stakeholders that participated in the process. So the multi-stakeholder dialogue and the cooperation that we had among the members of the UK MAGIG has been very, I think, efficient over the last couple of years since its existence. But I think the roots have started probably even during the WICIT, which was the World Conference on International Telecommunications, where the UK delegation had an open multi-stakeholder membership, including members of the academia, civil society, business and governments.
So I think hats off to DCMS for setting up this group, because it's really doing a trailblazer and setting up good standards of how coordination should be done on a national and regional level. I think Nigeria was another country that had a huge delegation in Dubai in December 2012, a huge participation from civil society on the delegation. And what we're really seeing now, I think, and not to predict what we're going to say next, is that the model of closed top-down intergovernmental organization is being challenged, so that other participants could really get into discussion between businesses and private sector and governments, or solely government. It is being open, and I can highlight many differences where technical community, and the reason why we have the internet, has cooperated really better than some other sectors, and it's been somehow entrenched, in the coordination and collaboration among the internet technical community has been also has brought a lot of principles that we are adopting. I think nowadays in internet governance principle, be it openness, be it inclusiveness, participation. But there are also huge differences in how the stakes, at which stage each of the organization is dealing with the stakes. While at ICANN, for example, we have different constituencies, and this is the area where I participate a lot. And we have different constituencies, contracted parties, not contracted parties. At some point, the board of ICANN makes the decision, whilst in essence it should be the community. And let's say the ITF, some of these issues are already laid out and fought at the lower levels. So by the time the standards get adopted, there's already been a discussion. And I would say that, lastly, to conclude, I think we do have to thank the WSIS for actually setting up the Internet Governance Forum that we have, because it has really somehow opened that participation and awareness. It has built awareness among the governments that participation from all stakeholders is what is needed when we discuss complex issues such as privacy, security, and so on. I'll stop here for more questions.
Thank you so much. If I may add something to that, and what I think MAGIG is a good example of is not only how for skeptical governments that it can lead to better outcomes if you have different stakeholders on the table, but also for skeptical stakeholders who think that, well, these processes, when you actually talk to the government, you don't get your views represented in the end product. And I can attest, having been part of the UK delegation to the Plenipot, that there's language in one of the resolutions that I've written. So, I mean, it really is a fantastic and practical example of how you can go both ways, you know, so we're all benefiting from this model. So I would like to open up for the audience, if you have any further reflection on that. We have about 25 minutes, almost half an hour. Yes, thank you. And I have two people here, and also just to mention, and I see Tony is here as well, that MAGIG has gone through a review process this year, and a number of us have contributed to that review, and it would be great to get your input as well, maybe to feed into that process that Tony and Phil here have been leading. So I'll start over there, and then we'll come back to you, Tony, if that's okay. If you could introduce
Yes, thank you very much. Malcolm Harbour. Well, I did speak a bit earlier, but I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, and I was actually at both the WSIS, including the 2005 WSIS, and I was also at the first two IGFs. But I became absorbed by chairing the Internal Market Committee after that, so I wasn't able to make time for it. Which is why I was very interested in the discussion, not because I've been directly involved in the UK end, but issues around managing multi-stakeholder dialogue are, of course, at the heart of European policy making anyway. I mean, in a sense, negotiating with 28 member states in the European Parliament is a sort of multi-stakeholder dialogue, a challenge for anyone to chair negotiations. But I just wanted to ask you a bit about this engagement with the European dimension, because ever since I've been involved, from the WSIS onwards, and I went there with Commissioner Likkonen. The Commissioner for Mrs. Redding, because we had a change there, was very prominent in Tunis. I think she was, the most senior European politician there, apart from, I think actually Anna Michael was in Tunis, because Britain was actually, because Martin was there, I can't remember. And I think part of the issue is actually there is, for me, not enough engagement at a political level. And one of the things the European Parliament has done, I think, has been, we've always sent a bigger delegation, and also we've had resolutions about, in the run-up to IGFs, to set some political landscape there. But I'd just be interested to know, because ISOC, GSMA and CDT are all very active in Brussels, whether you feel that in terms of engagement with the European Commission and the European political space, you're getting enough traction there. And because at a European Union level, a lot of the legislation that we're talking about that affects information society issues is European legislation, it's not UK legislation. And really, the broader question I think I have in the sort of MAGIG concept is whether you're getting enough engagement with setting UK policies on European negotiations. And the House of Commons is almost entirely disengaged from this process. I think I'm a retired politician, so basically I think it's the only other elected politician who came today. The House of Commons doesn't appear to have any engagement with this process. We're hoping, so I declare my interests. I'm a director of a group called the Digital Policy Alliance, which is essentially a multi-stakeholder dialogue of a kind, even though we have to fund it from members' contributions because we're entirely independent, who is trying to fill a bit of that space by getting parliamentarians to engage with the issues of discussion and write papers and come to agreements by discussing. So there's a series of issues there, but perhaps just a contribution for someone who's been an outside observer to the process. And I'm very excited to hear that you're so enthusiastic about the UK approach here. And we should try and learn from that and feed some of that back onto, particularly onto a European stage as well.
Thank you very much. I have a question here.
Hi, I'm Maria Farrell from Interconnect Communications, and I'm also a board director of the Open Rights Group. My question is, I'm absolutely sold that MAGIG is incredibly effective. It's a model, that I think a lot of countries should emulate. But I'm also really worried that over the lifetime of this Parliament, we're looking at 9% year-on-year cuts in most of the unprotected departments. How are we going to maintain even the abilities we have now to track and influence those debates, to coordinate, and increasingly to match the Chinas and the Russias and the other countries that have fundamentally, oppositional relationships to the internet to what we do? How are we going to, with less and less resources, manage to I suppose, to influence the process in a way that is positive when we're dealing with a much better resourced, longer term view, if that's okay, to comment on these questions.
Thanks, Lynn. Tony Holmes. I work as a consultant for a number of the entities involved in some of these discussions. But I'd like to just start by endorsing a lot of the remarks that have been made by the panel and also by Sarah, and also to congratulate the UK government. I think to set this up was something that was so badly needed, and it's already delivered some really good results. Some of the events that were alluded to here, certainly the Plenty Pot being part of that. It was an amazing experience where the multi-stakeholder members, as Sarah said, were allowed to actually really participate in the process, actually get involved on the ground when we were at that event and help shape things as well. And at the end of it, it was amazing, the reaction from some of the other countries who, well, they just stood in amazement. I think we did an amazing job out there and got a lot more success than probably we dared hope for before we went on that. And there are a number of models of multi-stakeholderism, certainly in some countries who claim to be multi-stakeholder. I would question that with the UK model, because they certainly have some discussions, but when it actually comes to talking on the floor, you don't see the multi-stakeholder approach at all. And we really put a stake in the ground to change things there. So full credit where it's given. I think going forward, there is a need for MAGIG to continue to evolve and to build on the success that we currently have. And some of the remarks that have already been made here, I think, endorse that as well. There are some issues where there are discussions taking place in a multitude of forums. Some are at the EU level, and I think putting the books in there is really an important element. There are policy forums in the UN, there are standards forums, there is the IGF itself, and there are broader UN discussions. And just to give an example of some of the things which I'm involved in already, where I think there's a need to broaden out the discussion and involve a lot more people who attend other forums and actually help us build the UK policy lines that we can support. Things around, the easiest one is the Internet of Things. The Internet of Things is happening everywhere. It's happening in standards, it's happening in policy. There was some discussion around that this morning. In the ITU, it's also being mixed somewhat now with some of the work on the smart, sustainable cities, which wasn't where that started, but these things are coming together now. There's work going on digital financial services, where we need some public policy discussion around that. And without going into details, one of the hot topics is around the digital object architecture, which has the potential to impact the internet as we know it today. So all of those things, I think, lead to a situation where there needs to be a lot more discussion. We're doing a good job, but we need to broaden it out. And some of that comes back to the question from Maria as well, who mentioned resources and the inevitable downturn in some areas that can actually impact our ability to sustain this. But that's another reason I believe that the MAGIG itself needs to evolve, because there's so much strength that we can get from elements of the multi-stakeholder community where we won't suffer from the same cuts, where there is the interest, where there is the engagement. And it's making MAGIG take the form where we can build on the strength of all those elements coming together and help UK government to take some of those things forward. And I also appreciate the fact that we've started to have these discussions in MAGIG itself. And I've got a great hope that that will move forward in a way where we can build the best model we have and gain from the overall strength that we have. All the signs are good at the moment, nothing but praise for it. But it can't stop where it is. It has to move on and keep up with different demands that are made on industry and government right across the board.
Thank you so much, Tony. And if just adding on to that and broadening the debate, I would be particularly interested to hear the chances of having cybersecurity discussed in a more open way, because when we talk about the internet, cybersecurity is the policy issue where the notions of sovereignty and the openness in the global nature of internet really come to clash. And that's where I think that's the next big question that I'd like to see, whether within the MAGIG framework or elsewhere is also taken forward by the UK government. Sarah, if I'm going to come back to you if you want to comment on these questions.
I will briefly, although I know that Malcolm was keen also to hear from other colleagues, particularly on the European dimension, so I'll pass the mic over for that. I mean, briefly on the EU, we work very hard, and actually we also use MAGIG as well for our engagement in the EU. So when we are within Council talking about whether it's Council conclusions on IANA or Council conclusions on WSIS or lines to take, or how we might want to influence EU coordination at these major events, then we consult MAGIG on all of those and ask them for views and to help us formulate the UK's inputs back into those processes. But I absolutely agree. We have an ongoing job, and it's not just a government job, but absolutely, really interested to hear the reflections of my colleagues across the table, because actually, how do we get parliamentarians excited, whether that's national parliamentarians or international parliamentarians, excited about these issues and really active and make these issues accessible, is something that I think we all need to do more of, particularly this year when there's really some fundamental issues being debated. Cuts. I think, I mean, we are all of us subject to financial pressures. Part of my sort of response to how do we maintain our our participation is through the MAGIG. I couldn't possibly, with my budget, my department's budget, and even sort of combining the investment that other government department colleagues in Foreign Office, in BIS, and DFID put into this, I couldn't possibly have the representation and reach that we have collectively when we work together. And by pooling that resource, by being smart about how we try to represent, being smart about how we try to share intelligence, and being smart about how we talk about tactics, is one of the ways that we try to mitigate what are, essentially a financially very challenging time for the government and for other organisations. So MAGIG is part of, not all of, but part of the answer. And the other answer is that we need to, it's the challenge that Andrew gave us this morning again, how do we make sure that government is properly joined up on some of these issues? Because not every department is going to be subject to the same number of cuts. Government departments who are very active in this space, we need to make sure that we're joined up and they're delivering really important messages. We've talked a lot this morning about development and about how important it is that technology and ICT infrastructure is seen as part of how we deliver our development goals. So, making sure that DFID is part of that process. They do have money to spend in this area, making sure that my colleagues right across Whitehall are engaged with and using all of their resources to support the wider government goals on this is one of the things that's on me to try to help to happen. And likewise, using MAGIG's networks, who have bottom-up influence as well, nationally and internationally, to reinforce the messages that these are really important things that everybody needs to be participating in, I think. And I absolutely agree with Tony. The challenges will shift. Where these battles are happening is going to shift. We're very much focused on WSIS at the moment. WSIS will, in some form or other, conclude in December. A new process, no doubt, will come out of that we will need to focus our attention on. But we can also see that we can see people who are on the other side of the debate, perhaps from us, will take a different view, operating in other fora that possibly we're not as active in at the moment as we should be. And the ITU is one, but there are others in the IETF, wherever it is. We need to make sure that we are flexible enough to look at where is the next big influencing risk and opportunity, and how are we going to be able to move and focus on that. And that's one of the things that we need MAGIG's advice on.
Thank you. Now, we have 10 minutes to go, and what I'd like to suggest is, if you have further comments on this, to save them for the end, and I hope we can come back and perhaps have comments, more holistic comments, when we tackle the WSIS. And what I'd like to transition to now is talk a little bit about what the WSIS review process is, and give a little bit of a background. And I'm going to ask Matthew to kick us off, if that's okay. And then Sarah's going to give us a bit of a background on the UK position and kind of how we're having this discussion within the MAGIG. Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Leah. We've got limited time, so I'm not going to repeat what was said this morning, but one of the important things to bear in mind about the WSIS is that we've spent, its original intent really was about harnessing the potential of ICTs for development. That was really the focus coming out of 2003 in Geneva. 2005, that kind of got changed, and we got a little bit off track in a way, because we started to focus on internet governance issues. So the IGF and enhanced cooperation came out of that, and then there was the financing element. There's a real desire, I think it's fair, both Dominique and I were in New York last week for a UN meeting on ICTs and development. There is a real desire to ensure that the next phase, when the WSIS process comes together with the Sustainable Development Goals, that the impact and this potential of ICTs for development doesn't get sidetracked again by reopening discussions that we've had over the past 5-10 years on issues like enhanced cooperation, and that we really do see this as an opportunity, linking the WSIS goals to the SDGs as an opportunity to really kind of re-engage in that space, really talk again about the importance of ICTs for development. I'm less concerned than perhaps David is when he mentioned this morning that ICTs weren't in the SDGs. I think that much of what we have to do is just reaffirm the importance of ICTs to SDGs. And so what we're seeing now is this kind of build up over the next 6 months into the WSIS meeting in December. But the decision on the SDGs will actually take place in September. So we're a little bit behind in a way, but that shouldn't in any way, in the 1st of July, the first non-governmental consultation on the 2nd, that's very soon. That's very, very hard for stakeholders, especially civil society, to get organized for, to get funding for, to go to New York, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many, many challenges in this, not just in terms of it being somewhat closed to stakeholders, but also the timing and everything else. We are hopeful that when the presidency of the General Assembly changes, I think it's in September, October, that we'll see, we'll have an opportunity of working with the President of the General Assembly to bring about another open multi-stakeholder consultation at that time. But right now, on the roadmap, as was explained this morning, we're looking at just one, which certainly from our perspective and my perspective is totally inadequate given the importance of the WSIS and the degree that it was open in the past, and we need to maintain that focus. So I'd say openness of the WSIS process, key, focusing back on development and the potential of ICTs for development's key element, particularly as we have the impetus of the SDGs coming up in September. So I think those are two key issues from my perspective on the WSIS.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to add any more, but maybe just from an organizational point of view, I think Matthew and I saw last week how many governments were actually interested. A lot of governments were interested in this, and there were quite a lot of governments in meetings that we sort of angled our way into. But the other thing I need to say is there were only 3 of us who ended up, 3 or 4, I guess, who ended up staying on. We had a meeting, an experts meeting, but then we ended up staying on, and I think the tension between not having other stakeholders in a room and sort of showing up and just being there is pretty good. I mean, I think that was really good. We were there, we were visible. I was the only private sector person. There were you and someone else from civil society. And I think we need to kind of think about that as the UK keeps advocating this. You know, we kind of need to do our work too to actually show up and be seen. So it's just something I wanted to point out around the process, and I think it'll be interesting to see how this continues to take shape. I think there'll be more live streaming of the meetings and various things like that as more of us sort of push, and as the UK government does a good job doing that as well.
So on the UK government, Sarah, going back to you. Thank you. I mean, I was just going to say a very few words about what the UK government's sort of very high-level approach is going to be to WSIS, and really then I just wanted to get views from the floor and a bit of, hopefully a bit of challenge back to us, whether we're focusing in the right places, what you feel are the elephant traps, and ideas that you have for other areas of focus or where we should be directing attention. I think. And first and foremost, I think I absolutely agree with Matthew. In fact, this is one of the real, I think, achievements of the MAGIG is that when the UK government started thinking about WSIS over 2 years ago now, development wasn't the top of our agenda. We were very much focused on internet governance and the implications there. And I think it's through conversations with the MAGIG and wider conversations that actually, for us, we've come to see and recognise the importance of the much wider scope of WSIS, the much wider development focus there, and how important it's going to be that the outcomes of WSIS are focused on closing the digital divide and more practical steps that we can take in order to do that. And so that, I think, is now going to be top of the UK government's list of objectives, is to make sure that we are trying. We know that the geopolitics of the UN is going to be trying to drive the focus back down onto these quite difficult issues around internet governance. The much more important issue is how do we get that next 4 billion people online? How do we make sure they have access to those socio and economic benefits of the internet? Whether that's access, whether that's because actually they need the literacy skills and the digital skills to use that access, whether it's not just about access, but how can they be content creators as well as users? How can we help people with regulatory regimes, licensing regimes, tax regimes that encourage investment into these countries? So really trying to get that
trying to focus on what are the core important issues for WSIS, which was reminding people what WSIS was about in 2005 in the first place, rather than where the geopolitical scrap ended up.
2003 started.
2003.
2003 was absolutely that. I mean, what started at the time was 2005.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, people will complain. I said, well, why are you spending so much time talking about internet governance when we don't have any internet to try? But, no, really, I mean, the tensions were low.
So I think that is going to be important for us, and likewise, we also have an absolute commitment, as I said at the beginning of this, to strengthening the multi-stakeholder model, continuing the conversation about how we do that, and two very sort of simple things. One is we need to get the IGF mandate reviewed through this WSIS process. We want to see that the sort of continued endorsement of that, and a continued endorsement of the IGF as an independent, genuinely multi-stakeholder organisation, not one that is sort of increasingly being captured by the UN system. That's going to be really important to us. And likewise, I think fundamental to everything that we do when we're talking in this space is how do we make sure that the internet continues to be a promoter of democracy, of rule of law, and ensuring that protection of human rights remain, and making sure that that language on international human rights continues to be embedded in the language when we're talking about new resolutions and tests around internet governance. So that's sort of where the UK's starting point is, I think, on all of these, and I think really helpful to get views from this room on what else we should be thinking about, whether our emphasis is right.
I think that's a really European starting point as well. I think the new commissioner. No, I've said it's to goes to a lot of different start. Sorry.
We have so one thing maybe with the field. Maybe Martin will for the use of yes.
Okay, thanks. Martin Boyle from Nominate. I think one of the things we've got to recognise is that the concept in intergovernmental terms of multi-stakeholder really, in this field, came from WSIS. That while phase one, as Malcolm said, it was very firmly focused on ICT for D, it was massively overshadowed by the early discussions on internet governance. And I, as a government official in those days, observed from the inside as the other stakeholders were invited to contribute, told they'd gone on for too long, and then shown the door, and the door firmly shut behind them. Between Geneva and Tunis, there was this gradual understanding and acceptance that multi-stakeholderism wasn't going to go away, wasn't going to die in the way that most of them wanted it to. And that, I think, has to be for us a really big lesson for the WSIS plus 10 review, in that lots of the governments around the table do not, they say, understand internet governance, do not have terminology for multi-stakeholder, have got no idea what it means, and they wish it would go away. They'd like to put it back in the box. That, I think, leads me very firmly into something you said, Sarah, about how we have started to see and take much more seriously the bit of ICT for development, in other words, going back to that original agenda. And I would remind people around the table that without the other stakeholder participants, ICT for development is not going to go anywhere. You need people like ISOC out in the field. You need the people working to bring the education and the skills into place, and you need the businesses to go and invest. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. And I think that is something that we should underpin what we're saying quite clearly with. Thanks.
You could introduce yourself.
Liz Williams, just to comment on a question. Sarah, and just a general comment to the room. I'm a new participant in this particular environment, but I'm very experienced in other parts of the multi-stakeholder world. Excuse me. And I wondered, just on your point about resources and Maria's point about declining amounts of resources, is there a context for then ramping up the formalisation of the MAGIG, which then has funding associated with it to enable and support the members of the group that indeed are engaged and work hard and participate and travel? And that's like a membership kind of thing that is funded and contributed to, because everyone benefits from that. The second question, and then a comment about sustainable development. As a long-time resident of rural Dorset, we have nothing to write home about in terms of sustainable development good news. And we heard a Norfolk example, there'll be one in the West Midlands, there'll be one in Scotland, there'll be one that we can all talk about, where not only our mobile phone signal is appalling, but our broadband connection is paltry and expensive and unreliable. If there was my request to governments and my request to this group is, if we're going to start talking about sustainable development, we frame it very, very carefully around sustainable economic development, sustainable infrastructure development, and sustainable community cultural development that allows people like me who choose to live in the countryside to actually operate. We don't have any good news stories about that on a comprehensive basis, and I don't think our house is in order for us to be arguing for those particularly lovely apple pie and motherhood things, but we must be able to demonstrate case study after case study after case study of ways in which you've actually tackled sustainable development in the context of ICTs. That can be from a schools base, it could schools and education, it could be from decentralized businesses, it could be decentralized distribution networks, but every single thing that we need to argue about sustainable development has to be connected to the internet. There is no connection to the internet without a properly working telephone system and a properly working broadband system. So the challenge I would, and I'm happy to contribute to all of that because I believe in it passionately, but that's the critical to our credentials to talk about ICT in the context of SD. And we know better or worse in many cases than in my work 100 years ago in Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos. We know better, we know further on than that.
Thank you very much. Phil.
Yeah. Des mentioned Wicket in 2012, that delightful month that some of us had in Dubai. And I think one of the things that we've learned and taken forward since then has been the need to be positive in the way in which we engage going forward. And I think it comes back to some of the comments that Tony made and some of the panels made. The success of Plenipot was not only the multi-stakeholder approach, but the fact that it was underpinned by that positive, be prepared to negotiate, understand what the red lines are. And I think going forward, not only do you have that in WSIS, but as I said this morning, you've got WTSA, the T-sector quadrennial coming up in 2016. Issues that will be discussed in WSIS will also be discussed there. And I think the discussions that go on in WSIS should also set the tone for WTSA 2016. We won't achieve the same, everything that we achieved in WSIS may not carry forward into WTSA, but I think that positive approach is one that we should take forward. And of course, MAGIG is the place to do it.
Thank you, Phil. I'll indulge one more question. We are running out of time, so let's do one more comment, and then we're going to wrap up and thank the. This obviously points to the need for to have this conversation continuously.
Ian Fish, BCS Chartered and Super IT. To answer your question, Sarah, I think your approach is good, and it's I don't see the high level. What I wanted to talk about a bit is below that level and pick up on something Leah said earlier, which is about, she mentioned cybersecurity, for example. We've also heard today about Internet of Things, a lot of talk about privacy, etc. BCS has been engaged with government and others and around this on these sorts of issues. But I think, hearing what's happened today about this, we've been engaging in slightly the wrong direction in some ways. We can provide quite a lot of information. Interestingly, the Internet of Things thing came out of an IGF. We've attended the last 4 IGFs, talking mostly about identity assurance. But at the Nairobi IGF, I went to an Internet of Things working group, and as a result, I came back and started a security community expertise within BCS on that. So we have something to contribute to that. So I just wondered whether you had anybody from, I don't know whether you had anybody from professional institutes like ourselves. But if you don't, I think it might be a good idea. So I think we can contribute to that second level.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for these insightful comments, and I'd like to thank all the MAGIG members who have contributed to this panel as well. I think there have been some excellent points made that DCNS, Sarah, and MAGIG will take back and reflect on. We have our next meeting coming up in just 10 days, I believe, so we can reflect on that there. So I'd just like to invite everyone to thank the participants of the